James Cone was a Black liberation theologian from the civil rights movement. For a little bit of context for these articles, the two that we focused on were an excerpt from God of the Oppressed, which is a very famous book he wrote, and The Content of Theology, which I couldn't track down what that is exactly from. God of the Oppressed tackles the larger notion of liberation theology, and as the title would suggest, that God is a God of the oppressed, that he reveals his nature through how he deals with oppression in the Old Testament, and that in the New Testament, the gospel of Jesus is to fight for the freedom of the oppressed, the humiliated, and the poor. As far as the content of theology is concerned, that breaks down a lot more into the idea of Black liberation theology, particularly talking about white on Black oppression in America, and at times just general white disregard in American history for the humanity of other races. But particularly, the quote that I liked was that the struggle of Black oppression is an ontological symbol for oppression in America. To go to say that it's not that Cone believes it's the only form of oppression, but that it's a perfect case study.
I think it's also important to note that Cone sees a difference between white and Black theology, in the sense that Black theology is very focused on that theme of oppression and liberation through Jesus, whereas white theology is very compatible with the systems of racism that have been supported through history to this point.
God is like an underdog God. That's like kind of what I coined him as. And I think that's just interesting to look at, because that's like a theme that's seen again and again and again, but it's not really present within, or like spoken about heavily within, white theology.
I think we all may be equal before God, but we have to like kind of recognize how we're built up in an elaborate system of racial hierarchy.
Cone's theology ties into Exodus pretty handedly, in the sense that the Israelites kind of exemplify exactly what he's talking about as God being the God of the oppressed or the underdog. Through their time in Egypt, they are enslaved, they're treated awful. And through Moses and through the miracles and the plagues that he provides, he frees the Israelites from this enslavement and sends them on their way to liberation and to a promised fantastic future.
Another interesting element is the similarity and differences to the between the two forms of oppression that you see between the Israelites and modern Black Americans, and through the civil rights movement. Because in a way, I think you could argue they definitely follow a bit of a similar path, where you have physical enslavement, but as time goes on, you're taking more social issues that are still perfectly valid and dehumanizing, degrading forms of oppression, whether it be economical advantage, political disadvantage, kind of going back to that point of being the underdogs.
It's pretty easy to take that in, like for like the African American community to take that in, because it's obviously two different time periods, very vastly different times, but it's very easy to closely relate that and take that in as a way to like hold on, because they saw, like, if you look back into it, if you hold on to your faith, God did deliver to them like the promised land. So that's easily something that can be taken a little fast forward and held on to like another point of faith.
To jump into an idea that we've discussed as a group before, definitely the notion of manifest destiny. It comes up briefly, albeit not by name, in the Content of Theology article, in talking about a general white disregard historically for the humanity of other races as a form of oppression in America. But an interesting dichotomy, or kind of other end of the spectrum to that, is you look at, once the Israelites were liberated, once they had been freed from their oppression, a lot of their path took a form that feels similar to manifest destiny. Now, granted, in that case, the key difference there is saying you have the support of God versus genuinely having the support of God. But it's still interesting to think about that notion of conquest.
I also like how like his main focus was also not to be like just peaceful people, but like to be peacemaking. Like the goal is to be a peacemaking people. Like if that makes sense. Like he kind of teaches them like Black theology is kind of like the goal is to liberate them from the white oppressors. Like they might not be able to do it in a peaceful way, but as long as they reach that peaceful goal.
It's not like just the oppressed job to like overcome whatever they're going through. I think that was an extremely good point because we kind of see like this narrative of like, okay, God has them, like leave them to their own, like they'll overcome, like it just takes time, but it's not their job alone, like kind of what Shannon just said. It's kind of like helping to liberate those people, and that's a very important thought that I'm glad that you guys brought up previously.
Yeah, there's an interesting, and this feels like a rather morbid point, but it does bring up a larger question for the future, in that if you go back to the 1500s, right, when you have Martin Luther doing all of his work with kind of spearheading the Reformation in Germany, pretty much within a decade of the Bible being translated into a common tongue for the first time, you have the peasant class all across Europe revolting and using the Bible as justification, totally rightfully so, where you see the first emergence of a liberation theology. But time and time and time again across history, you look and you see Christians being the one who put down other Christians who are trying to claim a liberation theology.
I know we've kind of transitioned into like history and our cultural moment. So I just want to kind of continue that by bringing up a really interesting just idea that, while Christianity used to be dominantly a European faith or, of that region, we're seeing increases in atheism and agnosticism in Europe, in the US, in predominantly white and especially richer areas. Meanwhile, countries like China and India and a lot of African countries are seeing some of the largest booms in Christian faith that are, available right now. And I think that also kind of relates back to Cone in the sense that as these countries are getting richer, like EU, North America, US, Canada, we've slowly been kind of moving away from God in an attempt to kind of make society and make ourselves our own gods. Whereas these poorer countries, these countries where the lower class or the standard of living, either one, is a lot lower or bigger, you have a lot more people choosing to support this God of the oppressed, this God who promises to fight against poverty in his nature.
Even like if we look back, like Foster and I are studying probably in Hume right now, like basically the liberation of Christians themselves, like when Christianity first became legal, looking at like a late antiquity time period. It's just so interesting to see that, Christianity didn't begin as like, everyone, it was fine to be Christian or it was great to be Christian. Like people were persecuted for it. And then we see this whole theme of persecution all throughout the Bible and this whole theme of liberation, but it's still like not really seen. I guess it's kind of, I don't know, I feel like a large group of Christians today are maybe like blinded to that portion of it, even though like ignoring the fact that, Christianity wasn't always this, huge loved concept or religion. I guess that kind of dates back to the whole white theology concept that we talked about earlier, but I think that's an interesting point.
How some people view as like Christianity is bad. When I tell people I'm a Christian, it's kind of like weird for them. They're like, oh, does that mean like you don't support this and this? And it's kind of crazy like seeing like how like there's a lot of split in between that.
I think there's an interesting kind of, I guess, I don't want to say lesson in psychology because I really am not well versed in that at all, but an interesting study in human nature in all this, where a lot of people like President Trump kind of claim a pseudo Christianity with their actions, with their beliefs. On one hand, you have President Trump, and this isn't me trying to get political. It's just generally speaking, claiming to be a Christian man, but on the other hand, he gasses a church for a photo opportunity, which isn't really the most Christian behavior I've ever heard of, to say the least. So there's an interesting thing where I almost feel like Christianity is being used as a mechanism, as like almost like a cloak to try and shield bad actions. It's that guise of, oh, don't worry, I'm a Christian. I'm a good person.
I think that the cloak idea is a very good way to put it. I mean, for many, I think that if you're a Christian, you're like closely relating, how you want to live your life with the morals and kind of the standards laid out in the Bible. That's a whole different story, but using it as that like kind of defense, to where if you do something, it's like, oh, but I'm a Christian. It's like this whole like defense mechanism or a shield of sorts. But I also think it's interesting what Shannon brought up. It's like, if you say you're a Christian, it's like people automatically assume that you believe things that are like nearly the opposite of what the Bible teaches us. So I think that's also something that's super interesting in today's society.